Welcome back to our weekly Mussar study group. I'm Batya Gage. So glad that you are joining us on this cold afternoon. Hope that you've had a great week and a great Shabbat. Here in Texas, we've had an unseasonably cold front come in, and I'm sitting here. I don't usually drink coffee in the afternoon, but I've got my warm cup of coffee and my sweater, and we're in the mid 30s, and that is pretty cold for us, especially in Texas and especially this early in the season. Well, I had hoped today to be able to announce the new name of our new shul, but we're still struggling with that. We're still trying to get it right. And hopefully that final decision will be announced or be voted on for the final time tomorrow night. And we will be able to go forward and serve Hashem in all of the great and new ways that he has for us in our future. We're just looking forward to serving Hashem in whatever capacity that he will use us in. So glad that you joined us, Hadass. I always look forward to you joining the class, and then I know that I'm good and I can go on with the class. So we're studying this next few months, two books. One is a very basic Mussar book, The Spiritual Practices of Good Actions by Greg Marcus, and he is a current author. In fact, I've emailed him a few times about some things, and he's a modern writer on Mussar. The other book that we're studying for the next few months, actually for the next year on this book, is the Mussar Torah commentary, which I'm really enjoying. And it looks at each Torah portion and pulls out a middot, a character trait, from that particular Torah portion. And I'm really enjoying that book. So this week in our spiritual practices book, we for the last couple of weeks, we've just been looking kind of at the basics of Mussar, the practices of Mussar. But now this week we begin to get into the individual soul traits, and each week we'll be looking at a different one. And this week, as always, we always start in Mussar with humility. And you know, one of the basic concepts of Mussar is always measurement. We're always measuring our progress, measuring where we are, measuring our balance. It's all about measuring. In fact, the literal translation of the word middot actually means measurement. So it's always about an accounting of the soul. And as we discussed last week and have in the past, we all have every soul trait, but we don't all have them in the same measure. Some of the soul traits you'll have just a little bit. Some of them you'll have way in excess. So it's all about balance. And I hope that you were able to take the quiz. I did hear back from our author, and he said that link has been fixed. And I actually went and did mine. And you can actually get a visual of how balanced some of your soul traits are. Now, when we talk about perfect balance, we have to talk about something in particular here. And it doesn't necessarily mean, even though in our graph, we had a dotted circle that was kind of in the middle that we said was kind of a 5 between 1 and 10. And we said that was balance. But in reality, let's say that you're making challah and you want all the ingredients to be in their perfect balance so that they come together and make the perfect loaf of challah. But that doesn't mean that you put 8 cups of flour and 8 cups of salt and 8 cups of yeast. That means that you put the right amount of that ingredient. So for salt, it might be just a tablespoon, and for flour, 8 cups, and for your oil, you may have, half a cup or whatever. That's perfect balance. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every middot will be a 5 on your graph. In your life, you might need a more than a 5 of patience, but maybe you need less than a 5 of order. Maybe that's just not a factor in your life. So having your middot perfectly balanced does not necessarily mean everything's going to be perfectly aligned around that dotted line of 5. We have studied, if you have been with us for a couple of years, as some of us have, hey, Mazel, yay, glad to see you're still around. Mazel is about to have a baby any day. We're so excited for her. So we're at the stage now where we're teasing her. Oh, no baby yet, but we know little baby Collins will come in the perfect time. For you that have been with us for a couple of years, we know we have studied humility so many times. In fact, I could probably ask you, what is the description or definition of humility? And you could probably give me just as good a definition as I could give to you. But let's look at what our author describes humility as, because remember, we're going back to, this is a football, we're going back to the basics. So let's go back as if we hadn't studied humility so many times before and see what our author says. He describes it this way: knowing your proper place in the world and acting accordingly. Pretty simple definition. Know your place and act thereon. Too little humility, of course, leads to arrogance and unbridled self-interest. On the other hand, too much humility is not good either. Imagine going to a job interview and telling them how awful you were. You probably would never get a job. So that's not good either. Rabbi Israel Salanter once said, I have the mental capacity of 1,000 men. Because of that, my obligation to serve Hashem is that of 1,000 men. So he wasn't necessarily boasting. He was just recognizing that Hashem had given him an extra measure of a talent or a skill, but that in turn, he had to use that extra measure of talent or ability for good and for Hashem's service. Humility in Mussar is not about having too big a head or having too small a head. Not too self-important, yet we can't sell ourselves short at the same time. Like I said, we need to be able to know our talents, know our financial situation, whatever it is, and recognize that we are to use whatever Hashem has given us in whatever measure for the good and for His service. But we have all encountered those with too little humility. We can probably come to mind several people immediately. They are boastful, self-important. Everything revolves around them. They're the heroes of their own story. But one of the dangers of too little humility is a disconnect from people. When you begin to see that you are perhaps above other people, then you don't realize the contribution and what they can contribute any longer. And, you may have worked with people that won't even take a vacation from work because they see themselves as indispensable and no one can do their job but them. On the other hand, we've all known people with too much humility. They're always got their head hanging, always self-effacing, never take up for themselves, perpetually the victim. Always something is happening to them, some injustice, some disservice, some offense. And our author says an interesting statement. Being a victim is just a convenient way to avoid responsibility for doing the right thing in our lives. Maybe that is true. I knew a person perhaps in this category, and I was asked at one time to see if I could help this person. But every advice or suggestion or anything I made was immediately returned with, that won't work. I've tried that. That won't work. And eventually, I just gave up trying to help. And what can you do for a person like that? But what is similar about these two completely different kinds of people? What is similar is that in both cases, too little, too much humility It all revolves around them. It's all about them. Whether they're always the victim or they're always the hero, it's still always all about them. One way to tell if our humility is out of balance is our relationship to others. If it becomes all about me all of the time, if every story I have to interject my better story, if every person somebody says I feel offended, if it's all about me, my humility has gotten out of balance. The Talmud teaches in Sota 5a an interesting statement we have to kind of ponder for a minute. A disciple of the sages who possesses haughtiness of spirit deserves excommunication. And if he does not possess haughtiness, he deserves excommunication. What in the world can that mean? Well, too much of an arrogant disposition, of course, is not good for a leader. We know that, especially a spiritual leader. But on the other hand, not having some level of what at least the Talmud calls haughtiness or self-confidence or something will cause a leader not to be able to exert any needed authority that he needs to. Being in leadership is hard, and it requires us to make hard decisions, and humility in the proper balance helps a leader to step up and into his proper place and his proper responsibility. So we always need to, or we always do, think about people who have exhibited true humility. And when we do that, the first person that always comes to mind, of course, is Moshe. Numbers 12:3 says, Moshe was a very humble man, more so than any other man on earth. But if this is true, if he was the most humble man that ever lived, how in the world did he have the strength and courage and whatever to go in and face and stand up to Pharaoh, this incredibly powerful world leader? How did he do that? You know, Moshe was a man of many talents, and those came with great responsibilities. But he stepped up when he needed to, but it was never about him. He only boasted about what Hashem did and what Hashem would do. He never talked about his own greatness. His humility was in the proper balance, and he stepped up to huge responsibilities when he needed to, but he accepted it from a place of service and not his own ego. In our book, if you're following along in the book, we are given a story of a modern day or somewhat modern day person who exhibited true humility. His name was Nicholas Winton, and he was a banker in 1938, and he wasn't Jewish, but he risked his life, his career, his fortune, everything, and he helped to rescue and save over 600 Jewish children to escape to Great Britain during World War II and the Holocaust. But his work would have gone completely unknown had his wife not discovered some papers in the attic one day and asked him about it, and he actually urged her to just get rid of all of those. He had the courage to face incredible risk to do the right thing and save these children, but he wasn't interested in the glory or the publicity for his own personal ego. He was a man of true humility, really exhibited humility in a proper balance. And of course, for you long-term students, no study of Mussar, humility, the trait of humility, can go by without at least a brief mention of the story of Bar Kamsa. We've looked at this story many times, so I'll just give the Cliff's version of it. But Bar Kamsa had gotten crosswise with some of the spiritual leaders, the rabbis in Jerusalem, over something that had happened. And so he decided to kind of get even with them. he went to the Romans and said, why don't you send a sacrifice to the temple and just see if they'll even accept it from you? But he intercepted the sacrifice on the way and caused a blemish. So when it ends up in Jerusalem, the rabbis now, the sages now have a decision to make. Will they disallow the sacrifice and thereby anger the Romans? Will they just murder Bar Kamsa so he can't go back and tell them anything? Or will they accept this blemished sacrifice in violation of the Torah? A hard decision. And as a result, the head rabbi, Rabbi Zechariah, who had too much humility for a leader and could not step up into his responsibility and make this huge decision, rejected the sacrifice outright, did not do away with Bar Kamsa, who went back, told the Romans, and ultimately they, in anger, came back and destroyed the temple. So, especially for a leader, humility in the right balance is critical. One last story for today, and this one may be very relevant, especially this week, and that is a story of President Franklin Roosevelt. He was not afraid to step up into his role as leader. He was the president at a time of national crisis, the Great Depression, World War II, and he brought about great change and great relief and hope for the American people at that time. And here's an excerpt from a speech that he gave at the end of his first term before he was elected to his next term. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master. Now, as often happens, even if humility is in balance, if we don't pay a constant attention, it can shift in one direction or the other. And that is what happened to President Roosevelt. He even went so far as to try, see if this sounds familiar at this time, to pack the Supreme Court. And because of that power-grabbing attitude that he now had, he actually led his party to huge losses in the upcoming elections. So even if our humility is in perfect balance, we have to pay constant attention to it because it can so easily get out of balance in one direction or the other. Well, most of us will never be a Moshe or a Witten or a Rabbi Zechariah or even a President Roosevelt. Our decisions, our balance of humility may never change the world. But if we can make small changes and get our humility in balance, we can change our world. And how often do we just go along? Don't speak up, let things go, because it's easier. And I know personally, many of us that recently have had to go through such a situation in which we had to really balance our humility, make hard decisions that did change our world. And if you want to, in chapter 5, there are a few other stories that you might find interesting on people that exhibited humility in one balance or the other. Now, one of our favorite people we have studied before is Rabbi Chaim Luzzatto, Path of the Just. And he wrote, you may remember this, wisdom is what brings a person to conceit and haughtiness more than anything else, because it derives from a noble quality that is inherent in the person himself, his intellect. We studied this in depth in our book this summer in Path of the Just, but wisdom, when a person has great wisdom, it begins to cause others around him to admire him, to flatter him, And pretty soon he begins to believe that flattery. And usually that flattery isn't all accurate and true. Then that uh, uh, pride begins to enter into him like a poison. And then he falls into that pride, and conceit and haughtiness creep in. And it often leads to a great fall. Rabbi Simcha Bunim, a Hasidic rabbi from the late 18th, early 19th centuries, he would, as he was trying to teach his students to be balanced in their humility, he had them do this exercise. He had them take two pieces of paper and then put one piece of paper in their right pocket and the other piece of paper in their left pocket. Now, on the paper in the right pocket, it said, "For my sake, the world was created." On the other piece of paper in the left pocket, it said, "I am but dust and ashes." So when a person was feeling down and dejected, they would reach into their right pocket and it would say, "For my sake was the world created," and they would be encouraged. If they were feeling a bit haughty, he would tell them, "Reach into your left pocket," and they would pull out the note that said, "I am but dust and ashes." And in this way, he taught them to balance their humility all of the time. Back to Rabbi Luzzatto, he offers a solution. And this, I think, I've quoted this many times. This is a great solution. A person's goal then is to seek honest friends who will open his eyes to what he is blind to, rebuke him with love in order to rescue him from all evil. For what a man cannot see because of his natural blindness to his own faults, they will see and understand, and they will caution him, and he will be protected. So back at the beginning, we talked about humility in the proper balance is knowing our place and acting accordingly. And some part of the practice of Mussar, the daily and weekly practice, is to have a little reminder phrase that helps you focus on the trait of the week. And when we get to humility, a lot of people will use the phrase, "Not more than my space, no less than my place." But that kind of brings up the question, what is my place? What is my proper place? Here's an interesting comment from the Talmud. Anyone who sets a particular place for himself to pray in the synagogue, the God of Abraham stands in his aid, and when he dies, people say of him, "This was a humble person." Now, how can having a set place to sit every time you get together at shul or the synagogue, how can that show humility? And what they say is that by having a set seat, people always know where you're going to sit. So that opens up and gives them freedom to know where they can sit. Interesting. What about for those that get the privilege of going up, perhaps reading from the Torah or given some other kind of honor? How do you accept that? And the proper way to do that is just to accept that great honor with humility, but not to refuse in a show of excess humility. "Oh no, I'm not worthy," and that kind of thing. Okay, so that covers our, excuse me, I got a hair in my eye, that covers the trait of humility from our spiritual practices book, but it also gives us some work to do for the week. As we know, Mussar is about practice. It's about doing. And so daily, and if this is your trait that you're going to choose to work on this week, first thing you want to do is choose a phrase, either the one we just talked about or another one that will help you focus on what it is you're trying to do this week. Perhaps write this phrase on a note card, tape it on your bathroom window, put it by your bed stand, someplace where you'll see it every day. The next thing to do is to observe, to notice. Anytime you're going to make changes in your life, the first thing you have to do is realize what you're doing now. If you're working on anger, the first thing you have to do is realize the beginning feelings of anger or impatience. And the same thing with humility this week. Notice where you are. Become self-aware of where you are. How are you behaving? And they give us some questions that might help us focus. Do you feel stressed when you fear that you have spoken out of turn? Perhaps you've spoken up and now you're, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Or are you one of those who leaves a meeting thinking, oh, I wish I'd have said something. I should have spoken up, but you didn't. Or do you ever have that thought, man, they couldn't do this without me? Or how could they do this if I wasn't here? So those are some things that will help you see perhaps where you are on that continuum of a balanced humility. We talked previously about choice points. Now, choice points are the place where you kind of come to a crossroads and you get to make a decision. You get to exhibit your free will to go this way or that way. And he, again, gives us some questions to help us focus on some actions that we can take that will maybe change the course of our actions. Where do you sit or stand? Front or back? Perhaps you always sit on the front and maybe you've decided to move back a few rows or whatever. Do you feel superior or inferior to those around you? How often do you make everything about you? If there's a conversation going on, do you have to interrupt with your own story? Do you rehearse past situations in your head, wishing you'd said something, replaying that conversation over in which you said the right thing? Or perhaps there's something about how you dress or express yourself that shows too much or too little humility. And of course, there's always our favorite thing, the journal. I can't encourage you enough and myself to keep up with your journal. Record your observations. You have all these great questions here, these things to observe and do, and record them in your journal. It doesn't have to be long paragraphs or pages, a few words, something that will remind you what you were struggling with, where you are. Put it down in your journal. We talked about how important that connection is between the writing and the change. And the next thing to do for the week is to actually make those small changes that bring about more humility and balance. And they give us some examples at the end of chapter 5. Perhaps, depending on where you are on the continuum, speak less when you're around people that are your juniors. So maybe, you're some kind of a leader or something in a group, but instead of doing all the talking, you do less talking and let them do more. Or speak up more if you're the one that tends to always just keep quiet about your opinion or input. Change where you sit, change how you dress, engage in more self-care. Not taking care of ourselves is too much humility, or it could be too little. Park considerately. I'm guilty of this one. If I see a parking space right by the door, I'm going to take it because my little car will fit anywhere. But maybe there's someone else that needs that spot more than me. Maybe I'm just being haughty when I grab that great parking space. Engage in an activity that you are not accomplished at. This is a good one. This will teach you to really balance your humility. Singing, an exercise, a Zumba class, something that you just are not good at. Maybe you're good at a lot of things, but do something you're not good at, and that will kind of balance out your humility. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit here and look at our second book, the Mussar Torah Commentary. Now, in this week, we have the great Torah portion. It can't hardly get much better than Lech Lecha. And this Torah portion invites us to begin a long-term journey with Avraham as he cultivates a soul trait that is one of my favorites, and that is the soul trait of Yirah, awe of Hashem, one of my very favorites. to think about this, think about a time when you were just overwhelmed with awe. Our book gives us the one of standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon. I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but I can imagine how small you might feel standing up there at the top of that huge canyon and looking down at this beautiful, humongous canyon. For me, it happens often when I get the opportunity to stand on the beach and look out into this endless ocean and just imagine who the creator was that causes that water to stop at a certain place. Or another one for me is a great thunderstorm. I can just feel Hashem in a thunderstorm. Perhaps for you, it's something else, a walk in nature, looking up at the stars on a dark night. But imagine those moments. You know, we're so easily distracted by our daily work, our tasks, our chores, our thoughts, our bills, all of these things. Yira then has to be nurtured and given a place in our lives. Alan Morenis, one of our favorite authors, who was the author of Everyday Holiness, describes awe, yira, as a natural human response to an overwhelming, profound experience. But we can train our souls to find awe in everyday things that happen every day. Every day the sun comes up. Every day there could be a beautiful cloud. There could be a beautiful tree, many things. So we have to train ourselves to see these things, to make time for these things in our life. And then every day becomes awesome. And Abraham had this ability. Early in our portion of Lech Lecha, Bereshit 12, 1 and 2, Hashem tells Abraham to leave his birthplace, leave his father's house, go to a land, but he doesn't even really tell him exactly where he's going to go. But he tells him, I'll make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. How does Abraham respond? Does he go out, Sarah, guess what? Eliezer, guess what? He is silent. He is silent as he ponders this great, awesome thing that has happened. Abraham Heschel, another author, I would encourage you to read some of his work. He has a beautiful way with words, said, when we stand in awe, our lips do not demand speech. Knowing that if we spoke, we would deprave ourselves. In such moments, talk is an abomination. All we want to do is pause, be still, that moment may last. Now, I'm sure we've all experienced awe-inspiring moments in which we were just silent because speaking would just ruin the moment. There was just nothing that could be said. A beautiful song, a beautiful day, and you're standing there next to someone and there's just no words need to be said. It reminds me of Miriam, the mother of our Mashiach Yeshua in Luke 2. And after the shepherds came and told her and Joseph what had happened, they'd seen the angels and they bowed down to the baby. And what did she do? It says, but Miriam treasured all these words, pondering in her heart what they might mean. She was quiet. There was no words. What words were to be spoken at an awe-inspiring moment like this? But as we continue on with Abraham's journey, his yira does not always stay constantly balanced. It kind of ebbs and flows at times. And so when he and Sarah go into Egypt, it wanes a little bit. And he tells Sarah, just tell him you're my sister and not my wife. His yira kind of faded a little bit. But by next week in Vayera, we see his yira strengthened to such a point that when Hashem tells him to take his son and place him on the altar, he doesn't even question it. Some people have said that perhaps his yira was out of balance in the other direction. Maybe he had too much. He didn't even question. But when the angel calls out to him at the last moment and says, Abraham, In that moment, his yirah was perfectly balanced. The book says that he, at that moment, was able to behold simultaneously Hashem's presence and the value of his son's life in the same moment. So strengthening our yirah, our awe, our trait of awe, helps us to realize that Hashem is present everywhere. Isn't that why men wear a kippah? Because they know that they're always in the presence of Hashem. Whether it's standing on the rim of a great canyon or looking into the face of a brand new newborn, which we all hope to do very soon. Morenis writes, however it may come to us, a moment of awe gives us a small taste of the cosmic mystery and an intuitive intimation of the divine. So when we strengthen and nurture our soul trait of yirah or awe, we deepen, strengthen our connection to Hashem. Again, back to Abraham Heschel, teaches us that awe of Hashem is the beginning of wisdom. Of course, that also comes from the scriptures. Being in awe of Hashem's presence and his role in creating all these natural wonders that we see reminds us that we should behave then in a way that recognizes Hashem's presence in every person's soul. Perhaps this is what Hashem was saying to Abraham when he said, Vayeh beracha, be a blessing, in Bereshit 12:2. Being a blessing is the consummate act of yirah in balance. When we are a blessing, we are aware of the divine presence contained within the mystery of existence. And yirah leads to wisdom, which leads to holy behavior. So how do we strengthen our soul trait of yirah? We need to plan for it, make time for it, carve out a place for it, nurture it. We can seek out and look for moments when we can become captivated and mesmerized. Make time for those moments. Take the time to consider a sunset, a rainbow, a budding leaf in the spring, a bee just buzzing in a flower. And in that moment, don't try to figure out how the bee does what it does or how the mechanics of it. But in that moment, just experience the beauty of what the Creator has presented before you. And as we go throughout our week and we get so wrapped up in the chores and the tasks and the bills and all of this stuff, again, we have to plan a time for this into our week. Plan some time to get out in nature or to just sit on a balcony or to go for a walk or sit out under the stars, whatever can bring you into that place. And then we'll be able to see the divine presence of Hashem in the faces, in nature, in music, even in the quiet. And if we take the time and the attention to do this, even the most mundane thing can become a wonder and filled with awe. This book also gives us some questions to ponder. If yirah is your trait for the week, use these questions perhaps to journal. In what ways does cognitive analysis get in the way of your being captivated by the grandeur of the moment? If you're more of a left brain person and you see the hummingbird hovering, you're trying to figure out how many times its wing flaps, what is the aerodynamics of, that kind of gets in the way. Our brain sometimes gets in the way of awe. What encounters with people or nature have inspired awe within you? Go back and remember some of these moments or these people or experiences that you can remember experiencing awe. Perhaps another human being. What about that person that inspires awe within you? How do you see Hashem's presence within that person? Then they give us a practice for the week. If yirah is your trait that you're working on, go for a walk in nature. Look at the beauty around you. Really take notice of it. And then when you see something that begins to make you be filled with awe, take a moment to experience that. and spend some time appreciating what you see, what the Creator has done. And at that moment, you can say, Ma Gadlu Ma'asecha Adonai. How amazing are your works, Adonai. Well, that is our lesson for the week from both our books. We have studied 2 middot for the week. One, we studied, first of all, the middot of humility from the Spiritual Practices book. Looked at a few examples of people. Our book gave us some suggestions for daily practices, for journaling questions for our journal. Then we studied Yirah from our Mussar Torah commentary. And we looked at the beginning of the story of Abraham. And it also gave suggestions for some questions to help us journal if that is your trait of the week. Now let's talk about these traits just for a minute before we end class. This is the point where perhaps, unless you're just super new to Mussar, that you would want to make sure you have your unique list of 13. Now, we are all unique. We all have middot in different measures. We've talked about so many times. So your curriculum is unique to you. Your list of 13 seems to be the magic number of traits to work on in a year. And your list is going to be unique to you. Now, where do you get this list from? There's many different ways you can create this list for you. One is to just use the traits as they come up in the Spiritual Practices book. There are 13 that we're going to cover, so that will be 13. Another one is to perhaps pull from the traits in the Mussar Torah commentary. And because it goes for a whole year, they're going to go back and repeat traits as they go throughout the year. Or create your own unique list. And if there are many more than 13 traits, and you can Google what are all the Mussar traits, and there's many, probably 40 or more, that you can see, they have some resonance, with me. I know I need to work on this. The important thing is that you choose 13 traits. Now, you're going to work on each trait either for 1 week or 2 weeks, depending on your personal preference. When you and you'll work on one at a time, then you'll move to the next one and the next one. When you get to the end of your list, don't create a new list. Go back and start with that number 1 trait and do it again. And you do that for a whole year. So even if you're using the Mussar Torah commentary to follow those traits as we go along, you want to make sure that at some point you go back and start the list over again, because they're going to continue for a year. So I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, you can perhaps PM me or something, and I'll try to help explain it a little better. Or another great book, if you're really wanting to get into Mussar study, is Alan Marina's Everyday Holiness, which is also available on Audible and Kindle. And I think I have all 3 of them. So thank you for joining us today in our weekly Mussar study. I know you have many other things going on in your life, especially this coming week, but I thank you that you have taken this time to work on your middot, that we could support each other, work on our middot together. And, if you hit the subscribe button, I think it will remind you each week of when the classes are ready. And if you want to, share with a few friends. We're just trying to reestablish our classes on YouTube on a little bit more independent platform. And so, share with a few friends that may have forgotten about us. And most importantly this week, have a good week. Stay warm. It's really cold here in Texas. Don't forget to change your clocks back this weekend. And if you haven't done so, make sure you vote this week. And come back next week, and hopefully we'll see you here, and we'll continue to work on and strengthen our middot. Torah study by itself is not enough unless our behavior is changing. All right, have a great week, and I will see you next week.